The anti-war movement emerged in the spring of 1965. Different groups and individuals, with often conflicting agendas, supported an end to the American role in Vietnam. In March 1965, in reaction to the introduction of the first combat troops, the first anti-war teach-in appeared at the University of Michigan. Over 200 faculty members appealed to students to express their reservations about the war and organize a protest rally. A similar teach-in soon followed at the University of Wisconsin. By the end of 1966, student protests spread to dozens of colleges across the country, including SUNY Albany, Sage Colleges, and Syracuse University, as students protested the war, the draft, and the role of the CIA. Student protests on college campuses against the war and military recruiters became quite common in the mid to late 1960s. Protests on campuses expanded to include protests against what students considered arbitrary college policies. As relations between college administrators and students deteriorated, some students organized sit-ins in administration buildings or college libraries. The more radical Students for a Democratic Society, organized in the early 1960s as a youth wing of the Socialist Party, started to lead more radical opposition to the war. In 1964, under the leadership of Tom Hayden, it tried to organize the urban poor but failed. However, on college campuses, it found a following and went from 2,500 members in late 1964 to 10,000 by late 1965, focusing on the war in Vietnam. A semi-coalition of SDS, SNCC, and CORE became the New Left, opposed to the war and the military-industrial complex. Some rock performers and folk singers endorsed the New Left. Bob Dylan and his songs Highway 61 and Desolation Row resonated with college students opposed to the war. In November 1965, over 30,000 people participated in an anti-war demonstration in Washington. As the war dragged on and the federal government increased the number of draftees in 1967 to provide soldiers for Vietnam, it fed opposition to the war on college campuses. In the spring of 1967, over 500,000 people staged an anti-war protest in Central Park in New York City. On October 12, 1967, 100 intellectuals signed a call to resist illegitimate authority, denouncing the war and taxes to support the war. Anti-war groups co-sponsored the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, staging an anti-war demonstration of 100,000 people at the Pentagon on October 21, 1967. Youth International Party leader Abbie Hoffman tried to levitate the Pentagon, but it failed to fly. Police arrested hundreds of demonstrators, and author Norman Mailer, who attended the protest, wrote Armies of the Night in 1968 based on the protests. Even after President Johnson announced his decision not to run again, anti-war organizers of the New Left decided they would continue their protests at the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. The mayor of Chicago did not want the protests to interfere with the convention, leading to the confrontation between protesters and the Chicago police in August 1968. In 1967, the liberal coalition that supported President Johnson split over Vietnam. Cold War liberals continued to back the president's policies in Vietnam, and working-class Democrats, many of them Catholics, supported the president out of patriotism and traditional Democratic Party loyalty. Southern Democrats opposed LBJ's commitment to equal rights for African Americans, but backed the president on Vietnam. Some liberal groups, like the Americans for Democratic Action, believed the war channeled funds away from domestic programs and the war on poverty. Anti-war liberals decided in 1967 to try to dump LBJ from the 1968 Democratic ticket. Economist John Kenneth Galbraith, national director of the ADA, led the campaign to dump Johnson. ADA allied with Reform Democratic organizations in New York, California, and several Midwestern states, joined with the liberal New Republic's call in September 1967 to challenge LBJ in 1968. When Senator Robert Kennedy showed initial reluctance to fight the sitting president, opponents of the war suggested Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy. On November 30, 1967, he announced his campaign to heal the moral crisis in America and end the war in Vietnam. McCarthy's challenge angered President Johnson, but initially neither Johnson nor major Democratic leaders took McCarthy seriously. McCarthy was a terrible candidate who failed to create an organization and gave uneven speeches. He would put his audience to sleep one day and sound like an evangelical preacher at another campaign event. McCarthy had no chance in states where the Democratic Party organization controlled the delegates. His strength was among college students and some middle-class voters alienated by the war. McCarthy did motivate college students and suburban women to staff his local offices and help in fundraising for his campaign. Surprisingly, he also attracted younger Liberal Party activists looking for experience in political campaigns and expecting staff positions if McCarthy actually won. Ironically, the failed Tet Offensive provided a shot in the arm for the McCarthy campaign in New Hampshire. To everyone's surprise, including McCarthy, he took 42% of the vote to LBJ's 49% and actually won more delegates. McCarthy's showing in New Hampshire revealed the depth of uneasiness in America about where the nation was going. Social unrest and urban riots also worked to the disadvantage of President Johnson. The Tet Offensive also shocked working-class Americans who supported the president and wanted to win the war. Even some of the supporters of the war began to question the drain in dollars and the blood the war exacted without an easy victory in sight. Pressured by family and friends to now enter a race, a reluctant Robert Kennedy announced his run on March 16, 1968. 2 weeks later, on March 31, 1968, President Johnson withdrew from the 1968 election. The president hated Bobby Kennedy, but did not want to see the Democrats divided and a Republican win the White House in 1968. Feeling that his withdrawal was in the best interests of the country and the Democratic Party, LBJ refused to run in 1968. McCarthy refused to withdraw and allow Robert Kennedy to unite the party under his candidacy. Then, Vice President Humphrey announced he would join the race for the nomination. Kennedy took the lead in primaries in Indiana, District of Columbia, and Nebraska, while McCarthy won the most votes in Oregon. Kennedy carried the California primary on June 3rd, but an Arab extremist, Sirhan Sirhan, killed Kennedy as he finished his victory speech. In the wake of Kennedy's murder, Senator George McGovern of South Dakota entered the race. McCarthy proved indecisive in trying to win over Kennedy's supporters. In non-primary states, Humphrey had the edge because President Johnson backed Humphrey for the nomination. While the president partially succeeded in stage managing the Democratic convention in Chicago, Mayor Richard Daley made a major blunder, allowing the police to go after anti-war activists in a public confrontation on Michigan Avenue on August 28th. Political commentator Theodore White viewed the chaos outside the Democratic convention and reported that the Democrats are finished. The Democrats nominated Humphrey, but the chaos at the convention combined with the confrontations outside of the convention aided Humphrey's two challengers, Republican Richard Nixon and Independent George Wallace. At the Republican convention, Richard Nixon defeated Nelson Rockefeller, George Romney, and Ronald Reagan for the Republican nomination. Nixon, after his defeats in 1960 and the 1962 California gubernatorial race, appeared politically dead, but his resurrection came in 1968. George Wallace initially sought the Democratic nomination and he appealed to Southern whites and urban ethnics angered by the civil rights movement and alienated by the Democratic establishments ignoring the needs of working-class Democrats. Failing to get the Democratic nomination in 1964 and 68, Wallace decided to run as an independent, creating the American Independence Party. Wallace got on the ballot in all 50 states and peaked at 21% of the electorate in September polls. Nixon represented the center-right elements of the Republican Party. He emphasized law and order and appealed to the same concerns of the middle-class voters that Wallace more crudely expressed to working-class audiences. Nixon sought the support of suburban middle-class voters in both the North and South, beginning the Republican Southern strategy to lure away voters who traditionally supported the Democrats. In 1968, Nixon did not try to woo working-class voters on the assumption they would vote for Wallace and deny Humphrey a victory. By October, many liberal, anti-war elements in the Democratic Party, looking at the choices, finally endorsed Humphrey, and many working-class voters abandoned Wallace. The fading of Wallace came too late, allowing Nixon to win a narrow victory. Nixon won 43.4% of the vote to 42.7% for Humphrey and 13.5% for Wallace. However, Nixon won a clear majority in the Electoral College and became president. The 1968 election provided an opportunity for Republicans. Democrats failed to understand the alienation of middle-class and working-class ethnic voters in the North, and Southern whites angered by urban riots, Vietnam, civil rights, and shifting cultural values.